Relations between the United States and South Africa have been strained in the past few years, stemming from major departures from the country's foreign policies. In 2022, during the Biden administration, the United States accused South Africa of covertly supplying weapons to Russia for its conflict with Ukraine, an accusation Pretoria denies. Last year, South Africa filed a case at the International Court of Justice accusing Israel of genocide in Gaza. The US, Israel's key ally, condemned the move as anti-Western. In February of this year, the new US President Donald Trump signed an executive order prioritizing refugee status for white South African farmers, citing racial persecution under land reform laws. In addition to widespread cuts to U.S. foreign aid across the board, the Trump administration froze all aid going to South Africa. As the diplomatic row continues, the effects of the funding freeze are setting in. The South African Health Ministry estimates that approximately 900,000 South Africans living with HIV have had or will have their treatments affected. In the immediate wake of this funding freeze and executive order, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio expelled South Africa's ambassador Ibrahim Russo, calling him a racist, a move Pretoria called regrettable.
While the world was watching louder conflicts and bigger headlines, a silent geopolitical shift was unfolding in Africa, and Washington barely noticed. South Africa, once a cornerstone of United States influence on the continent, began quietly rethinking its alliances. Diplomatic signals were missed, economic ties weakened, and in the space left behind, no global powers moved in. This is the story of how a relationship built over decades started to fracture without a dramatic breakup, and why that quiet drift may cost the United States far more than anyone expected.
The shift did not arrive with a dramatic announcement or a televised rupture. It unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, while the global spotlight was fixed elsewhere. Yet beneath the surface, a relationship that had taken decades to build was steadily unraveling. Diplomatic signals were missed, economic expectations drifted apart, and political tone hardened. By the time many observers noticed, South Africa had already begun recalibrating its place in the world, moving away from Washington's orbit and toward alternative centers of power. What looked like a routine cooling of ties was, in reality, a significant geopolitical turning point, one that reshaped influence across southern Africa and exposed the cost of neglect in an era of global competition. For much of the post-Cold War period, relations between the United States and South Africa carried strategic weight well beyond bilateral trade figures or ceremonial visits. South Africa was not just another African partner. It was the continent's most industrialized economy, a diplomatic heavyweight, and a political bridge between the global North and the global South. For Washington, Pretoria offered access, credibility, and leverage in a region where influence was increasingly contested. South Africa's ports connected major trade routes. Its corporations shaped regional markets. Its diplomats carried weight in multilateral forums, from peace negotiations to global economic debates. Maintaining a close relationship was not simply about goodwill. It was about anchoring United States influence in Africa's southern corridor. That importance was rooted in history. During South Africa's democratic transition, Washington positioned itself as a supporter of political reform and economic reintegration. Over time, trade expanded, investment deepened, and cooperation grew in areas ranging from public health to security coordination. South Africa became a preferred interlocutor for broader African issues, a country Washington could consult when regional crises erupted or global initiatives required African backing. Even when disagreements surfaced, the relationship retained a sense of mutual strategic value. But this balance depended on sustained diplomatic engagement and a shared understanding of respect and reciprocity. When that foundation weakened, so did the partnership. Under the United States president at the time, policy toward Africa became increasingly inconsistent, shaped more by transactional instincts and domestic political messaging than by long-term strategy. Diplomatic tone shifted noticeably. Public rhetoric toward African nations often appeared dismissive or adversarial, signaling that the continent ranked low on Washington's list of priorities. For South Africa, a country deeply sensitive to issues of sovereignty and international respect, these signals mattered. Trade relations became another source of strain. Long-standing frameworks that had supported market access and investment suddenly felt uncertain. Pressure tactics and sporadic threats of punitive measures created the impression that economic ties were conditional and easily reversible. For South African policymakers trying to plan industrial development and regional integration, unpredictability from a major partner was a serious concern. Aid programs and cooperative initiatives, once seen as stable pillars of engagement, appeared vulnerable to abrupt shifts or quiet erosion. Even when formal policies did not change dramatically, the lack of clear commitment spoke loudly. Equally important was what did not happen. High-level engagement dwindled. Africa-focused diplomacy lost visibility and momentum. Where South African leaders once expected regular dialogue and strategic consultation, they increasingly encountered silence or mixed messages. The absence of consistent outreach was interpreted not as neutrality, but as neglect. In international politics, indifference can be as damaging as hostility, particularly when alternative partners are actively courting influence. Public perception inside South Africa reflected this change. Media commentary and political debate increasingly portrayed Washington as unreliable, inward-looking, and disconnected from African realities. The sense grew that the United States viewed the continent primarily through the lens of competition with rivals, rather than as a partner with its own priorities and agency. This perception resonated beyond elite circles, shaping broader public attitudes and reinforcing the political space for leaders to explore new alignments without domestic backlash. As trust frayed, South Africa began to look elsewhere, not in defiance, but out of pragmatic calculation. The country's economic challenges demanded investment, infrastructure financing, and expanded export markets. Its foreign policy tradition emphasized strategic autonomy and multilateralism. In this context, deepening ties with emerging powers, particularly China and fellow BRICS nations, offered tangible advantages. These partners promised capital without overt political conditions, long-term infrastructure projects, and a narrative of South-South cooperation that aligned with South Africa's post-apartheid identity. China's appeal was especially strong. Its engagement strategy emphasized scale, speed, and visibility. Ports, railways, energy projects, and industrial zones materialized quickly, often accompanied by high-level diplomatic attention. For South Africa, these initiatives addressed pressing developmental needs while reinforcing its role as a gateway to the wider African market. Trade with China expanded steadily, and political coordination intensified within multilateral institutions. The relationship was not without tensions or risks, but it offered clarity and consistency at a moment when Washington's approach seemed uncertain. BRICS cooperation added another layer. Within this grouping, South Africa found partners that shared skepticism toward Western-dominated financial structures and sought to reshape global governance. Participation elevated Pretoria's international profile and reinforced its claim to represent African interests on the world stage. The message was subtle but unmistakable. South Africa was diversifying its options and reducing dependence on any single external power. This pivot was not an abrupt break with Washington, nor did it signal hostility. Rather, it reflected a strategic rebalancing driven by perceived opportunity and necessity. Yet for the United States, the consequences were significant. Influence that had once been taken for granted began to erode. Diplomatic leverage in Southern Africa weakened as Pretoria's priorities aligned more closely with alternative partners. Efforts to rally regional support for United States initiatives encountered quieter resistance or polite indifference. The economic costs were equally real. As South Africa expanded trade and investment ties elsewhere, United States firms faced stiffer competition and fewer advantages. Opportunities in infrastructure, technology, and manufacturing increasingly went to rivals willing to offer comprehensive packages backed by state support. Over time, this translated into lost market share and diminished presence in one of Africa's most strategic economies. On the geopolitical stage, the setback extended beyond bilateral relations. South Africa's growing alignment with non-Western partners complicated Washington's broader strategy in global power competition. Positions taken by Pretoria in international forums often reflected a more multipolar worldview, one less receptive to United States leadership. When votes were cast or statements issued on global crises, the assumption of South African alignment could no longer be made. Perhaps most damaging was the signal sent to the rest of the continent. African governments watch how major powers treat their peers. The cooling of ties between Washington and Pretoria reinforced a perception that the United States engagement with Africa was episodic and transactional, subject to abrupt shifts in tone and attention. In contrast, competitors appeared patient, persistent, and willing to invest politically as well as economically. This comparison shaped choices far beyond South Africa's borders. The legacy of this period continues to matter today. Global power competition has intensified, and Africa's strategic value has only grown. The continent's demographics, resources, and markets make it central to future economic growth and political influence. In this environment, credibility is currency. Rebuilding trust requires more than renewed rhetoric. It demands sustained engagement, respect for African agency, and policies that acknowledge long-term mutual interests. For the United States, the challenge is not simply to counter rivals, but to redefine its approach. That means recognizing why partners like South Africa sought alternatives in the first place. It means understanding that influence cannot be maintained through pressure alone, nor restored through sporadic attention. Relationships are built through consistency, dialogue, and a willingness to see the world from the perspective of others. South Africa, for its part, has signaled that its pivot is not irreversible. Its foreign policy remains pragmatic, open to cooperation with multiple partners. Yet the center of gravity has shifted. Trust once lost is not easily regained, especially when new partnerships have delivered tangible benefits. The question now is whether Washington can adapt quickly enough to remain relevant in a landscape it once helped shape. The story of this quiet realignment is a cautionary tale. It illustrates how major geopolitical shifts often occur not through dramatic confrontations, but through gradual disengagement and missed opportunities. While the world was distracted, a key partnership loosened, and the balance of influence subtly changed. As Africa's role in global affairs continues to expand, the lessons are clear. Engagement cannot be episodic, respect cannot be optional, and strategic relationships cannot survive on legacy alone. Whether the United States can rebuild its influence in Africa will depend on its ability to learn from this moment. The door is not closed, but it is no longer wide open. The era when relationships endured despite neglect may be over. What comes next will reveal whether Washington is prepared to compete not just with power, but with presence, patience, and purpose.